After I released my last video on the problem of evil, I got a lot of comments from Christians. I genuinely appreciate the engagement, and that's why I'm making this follow-up video to respond to the most common pushbacks I received. If you haven't watched the last one, the link is in the description. You do not need to watch it first to understand this video, so you can always come back to it later. Now, one of the most common objections was basically this: who are you to question God? And along with that, a suggestion that if I were humble enough, God would give me an answer. For example, one comment said, "We don't even know if we are going to wake up tomorrow or what we will eat tomorrow, yet have the audacity to question God why these evil things are happening in this world." Then they added, "All I can sense in the video is pride. If you really seek God with all your heart, this won't be the outcome. If you have a humble heart and mind to just know why these things are happening in this world and really seek God's answer, then you will know it. God gave the Holy Spirit to us for a reason." So here's my response. Pride and humility are not the actual issue here. The problem of evil is a problem regardless of my attitude, your attitude, or anyone else's attitude. Even if you think I sound arrogant, that does not make the question go away. Now, if humility really does lead to a clear answer, I'm open to that. I'm not saying no in advance. I'm saying, show me what that answer is. I would honestly love to hear humble Christians explain what they believe God has shown them and how it actually resolves the problem. But what I have noticed is that a lot of comments stop at the diagnosis of my character. You are prideful, you are not humble enough, seek God more, and then no answer. And I just want to point out something gently. It's one thing to say, if you seek God humbly, you will understand. It's another thing to actually share the understanding. So here's my request, and I mean it sincerely. If you want to psychoanalyze me, fine, but please do not stop there. After that, can you also try to answer the questions I raised in the video? Do not stop at seek God and you will get answers. If you believe God has given you insight, then share that insight. Lay it out clearly so we can all look at it and learn from it. That should not be too much to ask, especially if the claim is that humility leads to a satisfying answer. Also, the fact that I made a video about the problem of evil is not me questioning God in the way some people mean it. To question God, I would first have to grant that God exists, and I do not grant that. What I'm doing instead is responding to a Christian claim that there is a God who is all-powerful and all-loving. I'm taking that specific picture of God seriously and asking whether it holds together logically, given the amount of suffering we see in the world. That's not the same thing as talking back to God. It's evaluating a theological claim, and Christians do this kind of evaluation all the time, including to other religions. For example, many Christians reject the theology of the Latter-day Saints. They do not accept that an angel appeared to Joseph Smith or that God inspired the Book of Mormon. Now imagine a Latter-day Saint replying to Christians like this: "Who are you to question God? If God sent Moroni to Joseph Smith, who are you to say it did not happen? That's pride." Most Christians would not accept that framing. They would say, "No, we are not questioning God. We are questioning your claims about God." And that's exactly the distinction I'm making here. This is also why the force of the problem of evil does not depend on my personal beliefs. I could be an atheist or a non-Christian theist, or someone who is open but unconvinced. The argument is the same because it's aimed at a particular claim about God's nature. So let me restate my main issue clearly. My problem is not, "God, why are you doing this?" My problem is with the idea of an all-loving and an all-powerful God. If such a God exists, it seems difficult to square that with the immense suffering we see in the world. And if you think it can be squared, then that requires an explanation. And notice what I'm not doing. I'm not just declaring confidently, "Therefore God doesn't exist." End of story. What I'm doing is asking Christians to offer an explanation strong enough that the problem might actually go away. I'm leaving room for the possibility that there is a solution I have not considered. That is why I find it unhelpful when people jump straight to "this is pride," because that does not engage the argument. Now, just to be clear about my own openness here, I'm open to the idea that some kind of God exists, but that God might not be all-loving or might not be all-powerful. At least not in the way Christians usually mean it. And if that's the case, then the problem changes. For example, if a God exists but has no interest in human affairs, I'm not going to shake my fist at the God and say, "You must love us." I would just say, okay, that clarifies the kind of being you are. The tension comes specifically from the claim that God is perfectly loving and perfectly powerful, and yet the world looks like this. So here's the question I think is worth asking in a more honest way. Am I the only one who is expected to be open to revision here? Because from my perspective, the problem of evil has so much force, largely because many theists, especially within classical theism, will not let go of certain attributes. All-knowing, all-powerful, all-good. These attributes are doing a lot of work emotionally and spiritually, so I get why people hold onto them. But if you refuse to adjust any part of that picture, then the problem is not going to disappear. And at that point, the issue is not that atheists are too proud to accept God. The issue is that Christians want to maintain that God is all-loving and all-powerful, but they cannot offer an explanation that makes the claim compatible with the world we actually live in. Hello, my friends. This is Shane from Mindful Living. Thank you for tuning in. I'm a former Christian and a former pastor, and on this channel, I engage religious ideas with a critical lens. If that's your kind of content, feel free to like and subscribe. Now, the second and probably the most common pushback I got on the last video goes something like this. Yes, the world is broken right now, but there will be a final restoration where everything is made right. So the suffering we see today does not really conflict with the idea of an all-loving, all-powerful God. At first glance, that might sound comforting, but when you slow down and look at what it requires, it starts to feel very thin. From the beginning, it leans heavily on speculation. We do not know whether a final restoration exists, and we do not know what it would look like if it does. Even within Christianity, people have debated end times and restoration for as long as the church has existed. Some believe the physical world is temporary and will pass away, and that believers will live in the spiritual realm forever. Others believe the kingdom of God will be realized on earth, with a resurrection and a renewed creation. Some think animals will be part of that renewal. Others say the Bible does not clearly teach animal resurrection. Some believe the wicked suffer forever in hell. Others argue for universal restoration in the end. So already we are dealing with a huge range of competing pictures. There is no single final restoration that Christians agree on. And it gets even more speculative when this is used as an answer to the problem of evil. Because to make it work as a response, it is not enough to say things will be better later. You also have to add something like, this suffering happening now is necessary for that final restoration, or this suffering is meaningful in a way that will make sense later. And that is where the argument really starts to strain. Christians themselves know that a lot of the suffering in this world is not obviously constructive. Some suffering is simply destructive. It does not build character. It does not produce growth. It just harms, and sometimes it ends a life. If someone is swept away in a flash flood and dies within minutes, it is hard to claim that their drowning was an opportunity for moral formation. There is no real time for resilience, courage, or patience to develop. Saying that out loud would sound cruel, not profound. So the move becomes, okay, maybe the benefit is not in this life, maybe the benefit is in the afterlife. But notice what just happened. We started with a real-world problem, and the solution is pushed into a future world that we cannot verify. And then the moral value of the suffering is also pushed into that same unverifiable future. And that is the basic pattern I want to examine. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. One commentator suggested something like this: even if suffering does not make sense right now, the memories of both joy and suffering will enrich our joy in heaven. In heaven, we will supposedly have a deeper understanding of virtues like love, courage, compassion, patience, and sacrifice. So the suffering is not pointless. It becomes meaningful later. I understand why this idea resonates with Christians. It is emotionally comforting. It says nothing is wasted. But once you slow down, there are several problems. First, even if painful experiences could produce some moral insight, it does not follow that people would prefer those experiences over a peaceful life. Growth does not automatically make an event worth it. Let me make this concrete. Imagine your house burns down. You barely escape, but you end up with the serious burns and scars, and you spend months going through treatment, rehab, and therapy. Yes, after all that, you might have a deeper understanding of how fragile life is. You might take fire safety more seriously than most people ever will. You might even discover a level of endurance you did not know you had. But even with all that, I do not think anyone in their right mind would say that was worth it. Most people would not wish for that experience, even if they eventually recover, even if the insurance pays for the damage, even if the house gets rebuilt, and even if they find peace later on. The growth does not magically convert the suffering into something desirable. So when Christians say, in heaven you will appreciate your sufferings, I want to ask, on what basis do you know that? How do you know people in heaven will look back and feel gratitude for experiences they would never have chosen? Second, we also know that in this life, intense or prolonged sufferings does not reliably produce virtue. Sometimes it does, often it does not. Very often it damages people. It can make someone more fearful, more bitter, more withdrawn. It can contribute to addiction, violence, or serious mental health struggles. They hurt themselves, and unfortunately, they sometimes hurt others. That is what trauma can do to a human being. So what are we supposed to believe here? Are we really supposed to believe that suffering that breaks someone down in this life will somehow become soul-building once they reach heaven? Assuming they even make it there and are not condemned for how they coped with the trauma. And if that's the claim, why should we accept it? That's not an explanation. It's another layer of speculation stacked on top of the first one. Third, even if we grant the whole idea for the sake of argument, the problem of evil does not go away. It just changes shape, because we can still ask, why would a perfectly loving and all-powerful God choose a world where deep suffering is part of the process of character formation at all? If the goal is to form virtues like empathy, gratitude, or courage, why design humans in a way that requires extreme suffering to get there? Why not design us so those virtues can be learned through gentler means, or through moral education, community, ordinary hardship, and growth that does not crush people? So it seems like Christians have two options here, and neither one is comfortable. If you say this level of suffering is necessary, then God's power looks limited. God could not get the same result without allowing immense suffering. If you say it is not necessary and God could have achieved the same result through milder means, then we have a question about love. Why choose the harsher route when a gentler route was available? Either way, the idea that it will make sense in heaven is not really an answer yet. It is a promise that an answer exists. And I am asking for more than that. I'm asking for an explanation that actually fits the world we live in, without adding layers of assumptions that we cannot check. There's another problem that comes up when Christians say suffering is necessary because it builds character that we will fully enjoy in the afterlife. This claim actually runs into tension with a very common Christian teaching about salvation and spiritual transformation. In many Christian traditions, people talk about justification, sanctification, and glorification. The basic idea is this: when someone becomes a Christian, they are justified. God no longer counts them as guilty. Then comes sanctification, the long process of learning to live in a godly way, learning to submit to God's will, love others, resist sin, grow in patience and kindness, and so on. But almost no one reaches moral perfection in this life. So Christians traditionally say that God completes the transformation after death. That final completion is often called glorification. God finishes the work. He makes the person whole. Now here's the issue. If God is going to perfect people in the afterlife anyway, then why would immense suffering in this life be necessary for moral perfection in heaven? Because on this standard view, everyone in heaven is perfected. Some faith traditions teach that there may be differences in rewards depending on how someone lived on earth. But I do not know of any mainstream Christian teaching that says people in heaven have different levels of character in the sense that some are still morally unfinished, still in progress, still needing painful moral growth, while others are fully mature because they suffered more or practiced longer on earth. Some fringe groups might speculate that way, but it is not a common Christian position. So most Christians, if they want to be consistent, have to admit that intense suffering is not strictly necessary for reaching moral perfection in heaven, because God is said to be able to complete that transformation without it. I'm not saying this to score points. I'm saying it because I want Christians to think carefully about what they are claiming. If you say suffering is necessary for heavenly character, you are making a claim that sits awkwardly beside your own theology of glorification. Now, I know Catholics might respond differently because Catholic theology includes purgatory. In that framework, if someone dies imperfect, there is a post-death process of purification before entering heaven. But notice the problem does not disappear, it just moves. Because now the question becomes, why is suffering, whether here or in purgatory, built into the process at all? Why would a perfectly loving and all-powerful God design spiritual growth in a way that requires so much pain? If God can design the laws of nature, it seems reasonable to ask whether God could also design the laws of spiritual transformation differently. Why make it so that purification and moral perfection require suffering as a mechanism? And I'll be honest, this is where the picture starts to look morally troubling. When suffering is treated as a required tool for God to get the outcome he wants, it can start to make God look less like a loving parent and more like someone who insists on inflicting pain, even when other methods seem possible. I'm not saying God is a sadist, but you can see why someone would worry the logic points in that direction. So if you think suffering is truly necessary for spiritual perfection, I want to hear your explanation. Why is this the kind of system a loving God would choose? And why should we not see this as a deeply problematic feature of the theology? Now, even if some Christians insist they really mean it when they say suffering is crucial for building moral virtue that will later be enjoyed in the afterlife, even though they have a hard time articulating how that works, I have a hard time believing that is how they actually believe. And I do not mean that as an insult. I mean it in a very practical, everyday sense. If someone truly believed suffering is an essential ingredient for spiritual growth, then that belief would show up in their choices. It would imply they should be suspicious of safety and comfort. It would imply they should be less eager to prevent pain. But that is not what we see. Think about something simple like smoke alarms. If being trapped in a fire, getting burned, and going through a long recovery could produce spiritually enriching results that will later be appreciated in heaven, then why install devices designed to prevent just that? Why set up systems that warn you early so you can escape before you are harmed? Wouldn't that be depriving someone of an opportunity for growth? But of course, almost every Christian I know is fully in favor of smoke alarms and fire safety, and I agree with them. That is the normal human reaction. We prevent suffering when we can. Same with hygiene and health. People brush their teeth. They go to the dentist, they take painkillers, they get vaccines, they wear seatbelts, they lock their doors. They do not say, maybe I should let more avoidable pain into my life so my soul can grow. So when someone turns around and says, actually, suffering is good for soul building, it starts to sound less like a deeply held belief and more like an excuse they come up with when they are defending a theological claim. But notice what this claim commits you to. If suffering is crucial for developing virtue that we will later enjoy in the afterlife, then suffering is not just something that happens and later gets explained. It is part of the design. It is functioning like a tool. Because if suffering is truly beneficial in a net positive way, it starts to imply that the world is exactly the way it is supposed to be. A broken world would not have a problem. It will be a feature. The pain would be part of the design because without it, we would supposedly be limited in moral and spiritual development. But that clashes with how Christianity itself describes reality. The Bible repeatedly describes the world as fallen, broken, not as it should be. That is why Christians talk about final restoration. The point of that restoration is that things are finally made right again. So here's the tension. If immense suffering is actually a necessary and valuable tool for moral formation, then why would it need to be removed in the end? Why restore a world that is functioning exactly as the soul-making system requires? And if suffering enriches joy, why not keep it in heaven? Why not include drowning, burns, and disasters there too, so our eternal life can be enriched even more? Nobody wants that. And I think that tells us something important. Deep down, Christians still treat suffering as something bad, something to prevent, something to heal, something to end. And again, I agree with that. That is a rational and compassionate response. The problem is that when people are trying to defend the claim that God is all-loving and all-powerful, they sometimes talk about suffering in a way that does not match how they actually value human well-being. And that is why these explanations often feel like mental gymnastics. In case my point still is not landing, let me say it as plainly as I can. Appealing to a final restoration does not make the problem of evil disappear. Humans have been suffering for thousands of years, and animals have been suffering for millions of years. Whatever you think the end of the story is, it does not erase the moral seriousness of what is happening right now. A future fix does not automatically explain a present disaster. Some Christians respond by saying, in a final restoration, people will not mind what they went through. But that is speculation, and more importantly, it does not solve the problem. It is basically saying this will not feel like a problem later. And even if we grant that for the sake of argument, we still have the same question sitting in front of us. Why would God allow it to happen in the first place? Saying God will rectify it later is not an explanation of why God permits it now, because we can easily imagine a world that an all-powerful God could have created from the beginning, a world with joy, love, growth, and meaning, but without gratuitous suffering and without the need for restoration at all. The very language of restoration assumes something has gone wrong, something is off, something needs fixing. So why would an all-powerful, all-loving God set it up that way? At that point, it becomes reasonable to consider a different conclusion. Maybe if some kind of God exists, that God is not all-powerful or not all-loving, at least not in a classical sense. Let me put it in a simple comparison. Scenario 1. A person or an animal goes through intense suffering in this life, and then in the afterlife, they enjoy peace and joy forever. Scenario 2. A person or an animal lives a life without gratuitous or pointless suffering, and then in the afterlife, they also enjoy peace and joy forever. Which scenario looks more like what you would expect from an all-loving and all-powerful God? To me, the second scenario fits that description far better. But we do not live in that world. We live in a world with a mix of joy and sorrow, and that mix is distributed very unevenly. Some people live relatively stable and happy lives. Others deal with pain, illness, loss, and fear for as long as they can remember. If this world is created and governed by an all-loving and all-powerful God, then it is not unreasonable to ask for an explanation. That is not pride. That is just taking the claim seriously. The bottom line is this: appealing to a final restoration does not make the problem of evil go away. What it often does is shrink the moral weight of present suffering. It turns "this matters now" into "it will not matter later." And to me, that feels less like facing suffering honestly and more like looking past it. Now, there were other kinds of responses to my last video that I will not go into here, but there is one I find especially interesting. A few Christians basically said something like, if God has a morally sufficient reason to allow suffering, then the problem of evil is not a problem. And my reaction is, yes, of course, but that is a very big if. The whole debate is about whether such a reason exists and what it is. You cannot just place the solution inside an if and treat it like the work is done. If you cannot tell me what that morally sufficient reason is, then saying there might be one does not resolve anything. It is not an answer. It is just a possibility. And sometimes this response comes with another move. You cannot say there is a problem because there could be an explanation we do not know yet. But if that is your position, then it seems to me you are admitting you do not have an explanation either. So here's my honest question. If you do not have an answer to offer, why should I change my mind? Why should I stop raising the problem of evil as a serious challenge to classical theism? To close, I want to say something that might sting a little, and I'm not saying it to be rude. I'm saying it because I think it matters. A lot of us were taught very early to picture God in a specific way, all-loving and all-powerful, in the strongest possible sense. And for many people, that idea got passed down as if it were obviously true, something you accept before you ever had the chance to examine it carefully. But once you really think through the problem of evil, that picture of God comes with serious epistemological and logical baggage. So I'm inviting you to do something that can feel uncomfortable, but it is actually normal and healthy. Pause, reflect, and ask yourself, do I have good reasons for this belief, or did I inherit it? And just to be clear, that is not you questioning God. That is you evaluating a claim about God. That is you checking whether an idea you were taught is actually well-grounded. We live in a world with enormous religious diversity. On almost every theological topic you can name, there are multiple traditions, multiple interpretations, and multiple confident voices saying different things. So it's worth asking a simple question. What are the odds that I just happen to inherit the correct view on every major point, while everyone else is wrong? If you have good reasons for believing in an all-loving and all-powerful God, then I want to hear them. But if you do not, I think the more honest move is to suspend the belief until you do, instead of treating it as non-negotiable. Because when a belief is held as true no matter what, even when we cannot offer sound reasons for it, that starts to look less like a pursuit of truth and more like dogmatism. I know that might sound harsh, so let me say this personally. I've been on the other side of this. I was a Christian for years, and I defended Christian doctrine for a long time. I know what it feels like to protect a belief system because it's tied to your identity, your community, and your sense of meaning. But eventually I had to admit to myself that there were too many gaps that just have faith could not bridge anymore. Now, I'm not saying you need to end up where I ended up. That's not what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to become a former Christian. What I'm asking is simpler. Keep thinking. Be honest with yourself. If a claim does not make sense to you, do not silence that part of your mind. Sit with it. Ask questions. Look for answers that actually address the problem, instead of answers that only protect the conclusion. That is not doing me a favor. That is doing yourself a favor. And I want to hear from you. Do you think faith means not questioning the doctrines you were taught because questioning signals pride? Or do you think God would be pleased when people use their minds carefully so they are not misled by false teaching? Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.